We're very pleased to be joined today by Carol Finlay, who is the founder of the book clubs for inmates. And we're anxious to get her impressions of what the various types of lockdowns and isolation have done in terms of the program that she delivers and the prisoners who are able to participate in that program. Thank you very much for joining us, Carol.
Delighted.
Great. So can you tell us a little bit about what your program does, when it was started, how many prisoners participate, how frequently, that kind of thing?
Yes, it's we go back to 2008, and we started with one book club, and then gradually became 2 and 3, and then there was a bit of an explosion, a lot of busyness, and this was sort of covering Ontario. Then we moved westward into Manitoba, places like Stony Mountain Institution, and 2 book clubs there. We got some good funding to try and open book clubs in all the women's institutions, and we have 4 in out of the 5, and also the Indigenous healing lodges, where we have book clubs in most of those. So we have about 36 book clubs.
Wow.
Although how many, when all this is finished, we'll have left, I don't know. We have about 130 volunteers. We like 3 volunteers actually to be facilitating a book club, just because it gives us flexibility, but we do not want a volunteer going in alone by him or herself. And not because there's a worry about physical danger, but because a lot of prisoners, as you know, have mental health issues, and if ever anything was said in a discussion, we would like 2 volunteers to be there to just be able to corroborate what was said. So some of those, we have about 8 people who read for the book clubs, and we send in lists of reviewed books that the prisoners, a company guided by the volunteers, will choose from. We have currently now maybe about 75 reviewed books that we think are suitable, and asterisked according to whether they would be suitable to go into a women's book club. Reading interests are very different, and also Indigenous book clubs. Strangely enough, we don't do a lot of Indigenous lit in the Indigenous healing lodges, or where there's a substantial Indigenous population, because they're so traumatized. And as you probably all know, Indigenous writers search back through all of this traumatic history. So we have currently, I guess about 1/3 of that group is right now, because we can't get in, and I can explain why in a minute. But currently, we have volunteers who are sending in questions, and we have about a year of books for the book club members. They meet once a month, and generally speaking, the facilitators, the volunteers, go in once a month, and there's an ambassador in each group. You see, we've got a problem, and it's taken a few years for us to figure it out. But how do you run a book club when you're actually outside? And as you know, prison populations keep changing and changing as well. We can expect out of a group of, say, 10 to 15, which is our general sort of enrollment. Some book clubs have waiting lists of 2 years or more. If you're sent to Grand Valley, unless you've got some pull with the librarian, you can't get into a book club if you've got a 2.5-year sentence. So some of them are smaller, especially in the minimum, where prisoners are very busy, with outside life and so forth. Anyway, that gives you a little bit of an understanding. We need to keep our numbers up in the book clubs because we're responsible to our donors for those books. They pay for the books.
Nice.
As well, we just feel it's a sort of a moral obligation. So there are sort of rules about book club membership. Yeah, you have to read the book and you have to come. So
Not overly onerous rules, but yeah. Okay.
yeah, but you know, and there are all sorts of other rules about how you conduct yourself. We don't like to call them rules. We really actually give people sort of training in how to speak and listen respectfully to one another. Very new for most people before they come into a book club. We do this because we think that there are a lot of pro-social benefits from the book clubs, and we have been told this by CSC staff, especially librarians, that people learn to speak in complete sentences. They learn to be quiet when somebody else is speaking. They learn to accept that they may have to read a book that they don't really like, and 1 month because everybody decides what books they're going to choose. And we think this is sort of a taste in community, in being in community, and prepares them for life outside. Almost none of our book club members have had experiences sitting around a dining room table discussing politics or whatever discussions with family. So they haven't had that training. They don't have university education. You know, I'm saying this in a rather blanket way. Obviously, there were white collar prisoners inside, and a lot of them, for instance, Beaver Creek Minimum, are, you know, very well educated. Anyway, generally speaking, though, we're talking about people who don't have access to this sort of training and understanding about people and so forth. So those are all the benefits that happen. And the book club members have always told us, you know, miss, I read the book because I have to, but I come for the discussion. Nice. So they really, really like it. The other things that they have said to us is things such as, it's the only place where I feel like a human being. We call them by their first names, and we don't know their last names actually, but we call them by their first names, or we can get that. But we don't go into the past. Right. We look towards the future. We're not interested in Googling and looking up, you know, and when we give training to our volunteers, we tell them that. Don't do that sort of thing. It'll color the way in which you approach these people. And we approach them with kindness and care. So they talk about the fact they feel like human beings. They also talk about the fact that they're thrilled to get this sort of exposure to a variety of opinions. And we figure it takes about 6 months before a person coming into the book club gets rid of that black and white understanding about whatever it is that they're discussing. And they can start to see other sides and start to be able to talk respectfully to one another, which means acknowledging the other person's opinion. This all happened because at Collins Bay, the first book club we had, there was one fellow got up from the other side of the circle and moved over towards another guy and grabbed him by his t-shirt, and we had to step in before he was punched. And you know, we understood, golly, you know,
it's an opinion about a book that led to that.
Wow. Well, you see, books lead to life, eh? Yeah. And then you get into all of the big questions, such as, you know, courage and forgiveness, and especially things like courage and how to start a new life, and family, friendships, relationships, why things go upside down.
Yeah, so all issues there might well be sensitivities. Yeah.
So anyway, that's a little bit of, so we have these ambassadors that keep our numbers up. So we have there were lots of lockdowns. I would think that the two book clubs that we have in Max right now, Collins Bay Max and Millhaven, they only take place about half the
Is that
time.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And we also want a substantial number of people in each book club because guards just don't alert them, or the systems
They
fail
don't.
all the time,
Yeah.
or they're in isolation, but by whatever name you want to call it. We get the book to them and say we look forward to seeing them next time via our ambassadors, but you need a quorum to have a book club discussion. The same
Right.
as AA. You're not going to run an AA meeting with sort of two people and a volunteer.
Yeah.
So, this is our problem now. So our book clubs, our volunteers are sending in these questions. We are alerting the book club members through the volunteers that whatever they write won't be confidential, because it'll have to go via email. Whoever is supervising the book club, be it a librarian or an SPO, they keep changing all the time, the SPO especially. And then we don't know. So we're worried about doing this sort of thing, or if it were sort of a Zoom thing, that it's all CSC has access to it and it can go in a file. So when we close the door to the book club, now this doesn't happen in Max, and in some cases librarians or a person in education sits in, and these are people who are respected and liked by prisoners, and in those cases we trust them not to take anything out, whatever is discussed. It takes a long time to build trust in these book clubs and to really start experiencing wonderful, wonderful conversations. And our volunteers, for instance, say that they belong to a book club outside and this one inside that they facilitate, and they prefer to be in the one inside because conversations are so interesting.
So real. Yeah, absolutely.
They're very real. They're very real.
Yeah. So when you have book club members who can't attend because they're isolated for some reason or another, they do get the book. They don't get to be involved in probably the discussion about it.
That's right.
So how do they feel about having missed the clubs? Do you know? I mean, have you heard from them?
Well, yes. Right now, sort of two answers to that. On a general basis, if you lose a third each time because a guard hasn't bothered to tell them the book club's on or whatever, or, there are lockdowns, constant lockdowns, but they tell us that they come in with this sort of resigned feeling that anything that they really like is going to be taken away. And a lot of them are very depressed. It's a lot of what we do ends up as sort of therapy because they can't seem to get it anywhere else. And also, these are mature people from the community. A lot of them are teachers, and a lot of them have a lot of kindness and a lot of wisdom. And so we know that they miss the book club terribly. And but we've been getting reports back. I write letters to a few people inside.
Yeah.
We're also sort of hearing Warkworth book club, which is close to us, Warkworth Institution. Every day the fellows come into the library, which is now open occasionally, and ask when the book club's going to start again.
Good. That's nice. Yeah, that's very good. That's very good. And I gather from what you were saying previously that you're trying to keep something going during this period by sending in questions and sending in the books.
We are.
Yeah, and how it's not quite the same because you don't engage in those conversations that are really pro-social and seem to be helping the men so much, and the women. Yeah, so it hasn't been a good period, and this whole COVID, since about March, end of March, I would imagine you're not getting in.
That's right.
Yeah,
We took our volunteers out before they said they couldn't come in, because we felt quite quickly it wasn't safe. And a lot of our volunteers are older, retired people. And I had quite a heated conversation with Scott Harris about the fact that the CSC should have been faster, much faster about saying no more volunteers coming in until we've got on top of this. Now, of course, you know, the prisons weren't depopulated.
no, they weren't. No,
So
no.
their answer now, CSC answer, as in the schools, is to form these cohorts. They don't work for us because you might get 2 or 3 prisoners, book club members, but you might get none.
Right, in a cohort, yeah.
Yeah, in a cohort, and they change the cohorts all the time. I mean, it is administratively, these book clubs are a nightmare. One of our main expenses is a volunteer coordinator who deals with the prisons all the time. Let me tell you how difficult it is. If you leave a voicemail message, you don't know if anybody's got it. You don't know if they're away. If you send an email, nobody has a vacation memo. And people come and go. 9 librarians at Bath in a year. You know, moving around so much. I mean, I just don't know people in the big wide world who don't put on vacation memos or on their email or you know, leave something on their phone as to, you know, the fact that they're sick or not or on vacation. So it's an administrative nightmare. Plus, when there are lockdowns, we speak to the CSC folk and say, you know, these volunteers may be traveling an hour across the Northern Prairie in the winter, and they've read a whole book, and they've spent time together as volunteers mapping out how they want the conversation to work, and they turn up at the door, at the gate, at the, you know, and they can't get in. And nobody's bothered to phone them. And they have of course, they have all the information you could possibly ever want on anybody coming into the prison. So why? But it seems that we keep having to ask that. We have real problems with the way in which corrections treats volunteers, and we've had you know, we've had really nasty things happen. People saying, you must be you must be a convict lover. You're coming in. You must be as bad as they are. That's why you're coming in. You know, we have librarians who are involved in the program, and they get it, and they, you know, understand the program, and they're very supportive. But when there isn't a librarian who's amenable to helping us, it ends up with an SPO, and they change all the time, as I've just said, and they don't necessarily get it. You know, they think it'd be better if they were, I don't know, playing cards or basketball in the gym or whatever. So the cohorts are a real problem, and we have spoken to all the higher ups, the commissioner and the regional commissioner here in Ontario, and we're in touch with all of them, saying, can we not have a large enough space to have everybody? Could you just collapse the cohort enough for us, you know, such as a gym? For instance, Beaver Creek Institution has a gym that is not being used. You know, it is being used sort of 6 o'clock on, but not through the day. Could we please have a big enough space to have
socially distanced? what you mean. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but rules are rules, and they're set, and there's no way these cohorts are going to go away. And so,
How do you envision the future of the book clubs in the new normal and beyond? I mean, do you think?
well, we've closed our offices. We don't have a program coordinator. We have spoken to not-for-profit lawyers about how to do this. And we are really praying for the vaccine to be administered in, these are people who are institutionalized, like long-term care and seniors. I think they should get a vaccine in the first lot, but at least not at the bottom. But
Right.
I don't know. That's the only, you can't use media terribly well. It means that all of CSC is going to have access to whatever these men and women want to say in their book clubs. So once again,
it takes that trust element that you work so hard to build away when you have that kind of interaction.
And it's not as if they sit there and dish, CSC. They don't. Nobody talks about that much, but they do talk about their past and connect. They're trying to make meaning out of their lives.
Right.
And that sort of stuff, I mean, the system in Canada strips people so entirely by writing it all down, printing it all out, giving it to everybody, everything about your past or everything that you've possibly done in your life, and it follows you. So I was at a parole hearing, actually it was for Jared Schulich, who we know. And I said to Jared before, you aren't the sum of everything that you've done. You have your own identity, and we're not just our behavior. And then at the parole hearing, what they said is, you're always an offender. Do you realize that? Wow. You're an offender for life. And so for a lot of reasons, the book club members thrive in our book clubs, and well beyond the.
I mean, very rarely in the prison are they treated with respect and dignity of being a human being with something to contribute. And what you're doing is hugely important on a just on a personal level to help prepare people and to ease their time in custody and to recognize that they're human beings. It's huge.
It's very sad. Okay, I'm gratified that our program or activity. It's not a program; it's an activity. But I'm gratified that it is doing good work. But I'm horrified that this is the only place that so many of them feel that they're human beings. Yes. And so I find that incredibly regrettable, because they have so many challenges when they come out. They can't get employment easily. They can't get housing easily. And if they're stripped of all of their self-esteem, which comes along with their sense of worth as human beings, they hardly have a chance to cope with the challenges.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Carol. I mean, we need to have wholesale reform to concentrate more on building people's capacity to do well on the outside. And it's not what we're seeing in the correctional services these days. So
no, we're not. And I think that's why when they come out, they call us up. They're in touch.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
But I mean, John Howard does wonderful things, but it should be a seamless process, and it should be, but there needs to be.
Yeah. I think we all need to work at this, and we need to try and get correctional services to be more open to organizations and volunteers and other people coming into the prison to build a little bit of that humanity. I mean, when there's a lot of distrust between the prisoners and CSC, it doesn't help.
It doesn't help at all. And one of the mandates of CSC is a respect for prisoners,
Yeah.
and to prepare them for reintegrating back into the community. And I don't see either of those. I don't know how many times I've had to call the correctional investigator watching how prisoners are treated. And I mean, I think they need the whole ethos inside the prisons needs to be reshaped, and these people need to have a lot of sensitivity training. I mean, I remember when we were reading Obama's book about, journeys around my father, I said, oh, you fellas, you're going to like this, because he had the cards stacked against him. When he was born, his parents split and he didn't see his father. He was raised by grandparents and so forth. And they said, oh, Carol, come on, we'll tell you a little bit about us. There was one guy whose only bed was the bathtub. He lived in the bathtub till he was 16. There was an Indigenous fellow, had 17 foster homes.
Wow. Yeah. It's inconceivable, the trials that many of these people have experienced.
Huge. And their courage is amazing.
Yeah. And the resilience, if you can just tap into it, they've overcome a lot.
Huge amount. But, as the old adage is, prison is tough, but leaving prison is even tougher.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's really, really difficult.
Yeah. Well, we will continue to work on that for sure. But I want to tell you how much all of us respect the book clubs and know what great work is being done there, and how wonderful it is to have so many excellent volunteers going in and cultivating an atmosphere of humanity with the prisoners. It's just wonderful. And we hope you're back in there really soon.
Thank you very much. Thank
you for taking the time with us today, Karen. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure. Goodbye. Thanks very much.
Joined by George MYETTE of the Seventh Step. That's an organization that goes into prisons and supports prisoners when they're in the community. And I'm sure that George's fellow members will have had some challenges getting into the prisons because of lockdowns and COVID and a variety of other things. So we're happy to hear George on these issues. Maybe, George, you could start off a little bit by telling us basically what your program is about and where in Canada people are going into prisons.
Well, we're largely a volunteer-driven organization. We're a self-help organization first, and comprised of people who have been through the system, people who are presently serving sentences, and non-offender volunteer members from the community who participate in our groups, which generally tend to be either in the community or in the institution. So we have chapters across Canada. We have a bit of a gap in the prairies at present, working on changing that. But the institutions and, say, federal institutions that we go into are places like William Head, Bowden Institution, Drumheller, HMP in St. John's, Nova Women's Institution in Nova Scotia, and then there are some provincial institutions as well.
Great. And so have you found any issues with respect to prisoners not being able to participate in your group, or members of your organization not being able to get into the prisons because of lockdowns, or prisoners being placed in isolation or anything like that?
Well, over the years, yes, particularly, of course, during this last year in 8 months or whatever that COVID's been with us, and which is a general lockdown across the country, more or less. And so, we've been heavily impacted with that, and community members up until in the fall, and only certain institutions were able to enter the institution on a limited basis and have contact. But certainly, over an extended period of time in the past, we've seen lockdowns that will occur all of a sudden. And in some cases, I can remember traveling quite a distance to get to an institution before this is, previously, of course, but before the communications were as good. Well, and I'll say that in a bit of an advised sense, if that's the right word, now, to let you know that the place has actually been locked down. So of course, in that case, those cases, people have been restricted from being able to attend our group meetings, which for some people, and I will say in institutions, having that kind of contact, because the way we operate is it's primarily peer driven. And so in a lot of cases for people that are in the institutions, they've been waiting for that meeting to talk about something very personal that they don't really want to talk about with anybody else in the institution, particularly staff. And, you know, and in some cases, it's just a personal thing that they really want to discuss. They're just not comfortable other than with their peers in a structured situation. I mean, obviously, if they're able to have contact with another peer, they can talk about it. But in the case of actual isolation lockdown, where the person isn't able to have contact with anyone else, then they, you know, they're even more isolated and have to, you know, deal with it on their own, which of course then raises other issues of, you know, mental anguish or whatever.
Yeah. So there is kind of an interesting trust that would build up fairly quickly when you're talking about peers or people who've been through the system talking with fellow prisoners, which is huge, because some things they're not comfortable talking about with other active prisoners, and certainly not talking about with the correctional authorities, where they're going to record it and put it in their files. So I can see why the lack of human contact and supportive environment that you provide, the absence of that would be really frustrating and upsetting for prisoners who are relying on it.
For sure. And not just peers, you know, in other organizations that don't necessarily rely a lot on the peer support, it's somebody from the outside who is not staff of the institution that person has developed a trust relationship with, and a volunteer, you know, an elder, if it's an Indigenous person, a chaplain. And in those cases, it's somebody that's not part of that system that is holding that person. And for long-term offenders, and you know, their whole goal is to be able to get out of the institution. I mean, they, in some cases, not in some cases, in a lot of cases, of course, and that's where we work on it in our self-help groups, is to work on staying out, because getting out is just the first step. And but for people who, if they're feeling a lot of stress and mental instability, and their whole goal is to get out of that institution, anything that interferes with that just raises that stress level up that much higher. And so not being able to have contact with someone who they feel is their link to the outside is probably, you know, the biggest issue that they're going to have to deal with internally, as far as how they're actually handling themselves. And that's where I think you start to see people who become desperate. And so that type of contact, I think, is one of the most important features of people coming in from the outside. And because as much as you have really good people working in institutions across Canada, because some people really have the compassion and the interest to help people, they're still part of the structure, the system that is holding that person against their will, so to speak. And so that's where the importance of the outside contact comes in, to keep that, you know, that sense of hope alive within that individual.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think what's kind of unique about your organization is that you do provide support from the inside and as they come into the community, which is a very difficult transition for people. So, you know, having the in-reach, which a lot of organizations who provide transitional support don't necessarily have, but you are able to build up a lot of trust and support for people as they move through the system.
That's right.
Do you see technology as possibly being a way to continue to do that when we're in these sort of lockdown situations?
Absolutely. And I think something like video conferencing, for example, if the person inside the institution is able to somehow be in contact with a community support group, because in most cases, you know, and we're not unique in that regard, that organizations across the country have community support groups that deliver programs in the institution. And just for example, with the way we operate with our community support group, whether it's in, you know, St. John's or Halifax or Victoria, is we will also bring people out on escorted temporary absence on a regular basis. And of course, you know, with lockdowns, that doesn't happen. And so, of course, if you have some means of that person inside being able to communicate with the outside support group, then they would certainly, that would be an aid to them to be able to deal with their situation inside. And so I would say yes, video conferencing technology is probably one of the the best ways of being able to do that. The next best thing to be in the room with the person. So I would say that if there's a way, as long as it doesn't replace, say, direct personal contact, because sometimes it's so convenient, say, oh, gee, this works great, let's just use that instead. And as you know, Catherine, we've talked about this regarding family visiting in the past, that suddenly, because there were organizations that were concerned about if video conferencing became very popular and active, then suddenly it's easier for the institutions not to allow the in-person visit. So I think as a supplement, not a replacement, would be my main thought on it.
Yeah, I think it certainly makes sense when you have extended lockdowns like we've seen under the COVID regime to some kind of, but I agree with you. There's no way it could replace the in-person connection that people feel. And I think they even value the fact that people have taken, your volunteers have taken the effort to come often long distances to get in there to
for sure,
to help them. Yeah, it's challenging. How would you see your program proceeding under the new normal, shall we say, as CSE likes to call it?
Yeah, well, hopefully it isn't the new normal. I'm hoping it's the stopgap, until we see better times, because my feeling is that over the years, access to institutions in a lot of cases was becoming more restrictive rather than less restrictive. More so once you got above minimum into medium and obviously maximum. So I would say that it's going to be a challenge, no doubt. For example, under the opening of the after COVID, and of course that's not the only type of lockdown, obviously, that occurs, but it's been the most prominent in the last while. Only one volunteer from an organization could go in on a weekly basis to meet with the group inside the institution, and so you start to lose that extra support of the volunteers coming in, and so that in itself, if something like that continued, and again, on an interim basis, I understand that you're trying to limit the amount of contact as much as possible, and so I would say that every effort should be made to try and not necessarily see a new normal as the normal. I mean, for a long period of time, because I think if anything, we have to move more towards increased contact, particularly if we're talking about with SIUs, for example, where people suddenly, it used to be, okay, solitary supposedly was an exceptional circumstance. The person was locked up. I have a bit of a concern about SIUs becoming sort of a new normal way of managing an institution, and it's almost like it's now more convenient to suddenly put people into isolation as opposed to less convenient. So that would be a concern, and so I would say that it's more of a philosophical almost approach to how do we manage this, and if the whole idea is reintegration, let's look at reintegration, not isolation, because that's not going to reach the objectives that we're looking at about having a safer community. Because if people come out, less prepared to be in an unstructured, unsupervised situation in the community, then that we're not doing the community any favors, and I'm not doing the inmates any favors.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think we're all hopeful that the programming that had been in place will be revived in its entirety. And in fact, hopefully there'll be more in reach and more opportunities for people to support the reintegration of prisoners. I mean, the value of the volunteers and the value of the programs of people going in, I think, cannot be underestimated in terms of helping prisoners.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I guess again, I just want to stress that you know, I hate to look at. I'm an optimist. I mean, I wouldn't have been volunteering in this justice system for the last 45, 47 years if I wasn't an optimist. And you know, we've been through polio, we've been through smallpox, we've been through diphtheria. This is a virus, and this is a virus that you know we're developing vaccines for, and we're going to hopefully eradicate this. I mean, probably not entirely from society, but I think if you know the mindset is that we can't beat this thing and we're going to just give up, we're just going to have a new normal, then you know we've really let ourselves down as a society in terms of what we can do to try to recover from this. And I really think that's got to be the goal, and particularly within you know institutions where obviously right now that's where some of the biggest impacts have been, probably more so for seniors, but certainly it's been you know in the correctional institutions as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very frightening. And with this extended period of lockdown, it starts to become a routine for CSC to keep people away from programs, and it's it is more work for them to have a vibrant, pro-social, lots of programs and lots of activity in the prisons. And I worry that they're out of step with that now, and it's going to take some effort to get it back.
Yes, and just on that note, and this came up as part of the discussion that we had at our group meeting last night about using WebEx for trying to communicate with our members that are in institutions where we can't have direct access to them. One of the other caveats to that is there a staff person available? Because the staff person has to be there with the individual in order for them to access the video conferencing computer or whatever it is they're using. And so I think that if you're going to talk about how do we enhance the contact, that has to be an area that probably has to be focused on as well, that you actually have more program staff that are available that can actually assist to manage that situation and assist the inmates to be able to to use the video conferencing technology. So I think that in that sense, there almost has to be a concerted effort to focus on programming, not to say, oh, well, this is more convenient now because, we can just act, as a security type of system as opposed to a program-based system.
And I think there needs to be some greater effort to speed up the clearances for the volunteers. You've been working on that for a very long time.
Oh, for sure.
And to let people know when the prison is locked down. Like it's not, I mean, it's very discouraging for people to drive that distance and find out that they can't get in,
And I think in that case, and I can say, and I will say this in a positive sense, in our area where I happen to live out on the West Coast, there's been a concerted effort by the social program officer, and I'll say the name, William Head Institution, to let volunteers know. And they have developed a really good contact system, and they are really, because they're really focused on volunteers participating in that particular, again, a minimum security institution, they actually support the volunteers really well. And I would say that should be the case across the country. Why couldn't it be consistent? And
the different levels of security too, right? So,
yeah, absolutely. And be able to, if you value the involvement of the outside community and volunteers, then it's important. And as you said, make access easier. It's gotten much more difficult over the last couple of years in particular for people to get their security clearance, to be able to find the right time to get to the institution, meet the security person that's doing their processing, trying to coordinate all that. And for volunteers especially, and a lot of times, volunteers have a lot of other things going on. It's not like they have nothing else to do. And especially if they happen to be students, which are great volunteers, and they're the future of volunteerism and people who are working in the system. And recently, and we had contact with the Queen's Correctional Volunteer Group and in Kingston, and amazed at what they've been able to do by their own initiative, but they are fully supported in that area by it's somebody in the CSC regional office that managed to. Pardon?
Was it Scott Harris? I think he's recently.
No, this was actually somebody more at an actual, sort of call it a program level, not a senior executive, but they arrange, for example, something I haven't seen elsewhere, for people to get clearance and be able to go to a variety of institutions, but they didn't have to get clearance at a specific institution. They got a general clearance in the area.
That's great.
And I thought, man, that's the way to encourage participation. And so that's the kind of thing I think that probably now, if we're going to talk about a so-called new normal, that maybe CSC in particular has to look at as far as volunteer clearances and being able to have people a more streamlined process to get people into.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I mean, being an optimist, George, I mean, I guess it was the Prime Minister who was talking about doing a reset after COVID. I mean, maybe this is an opportunity to do a bit of a reset in terms of getting more programs and more activity into the prisons.
Absolutely.
It's got to be recognized. Yeah.
And to go forward, not backwards. I mean, that's really,
Absolutely.
I think, what we have to look at some of our best practices, the lessons we've learned, and build on that. And sometimes it's not easy. That's the thing. A lot of people think, well, let's take the easy route and we'll get this done. Whereas it takes hard work sometimes, and that's what happens when really good things. Well, for really good things to happen, sometimes you have to do the hard work to make it happen.
Okay, George, we're counting on you to do the hard work. I'll help, but
I'll continue on.
we'll get it done. Thank you so much for this, George. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No problem. Thank you.
Pleased to be joined by Susan Haines, and we're going to talk to her today not about her day job as Executive Director of the National Associations Active in Criminal Justice, but about her volunteer activity as part of the Millhaven Lifers Liaison Group, where she and others regularly go to Millhaven Prison. And we're very curious to know whether or not particularly when this is a maximum prison, whether there have been interruptions because of lockdowns, members being in isolation, or more recently with respect to the COVID general lack of access. Susan, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. Could you tell us a little bit about your activities with the Millhaven Lifers Liaison Group?
Sure. This group has really been going since about 2015, 2016. We've currently got, I think my count is right, 6 volunteers, including myself, that are, well, essentially security screened and trained to go in and visit. So essentially what we do is traditionally we would go into the institution and meet with the lifers, the men serving life sentences at Millhaven, who are part of the lifers group there, about once a month was our sort of regular sort of schedule. We also meet just as a group outside. So we have outside meetings to, coordinate ourselves, get organized, that kind of thing. And then really what I think our primary purpose has really been to bring the outside in and bring the inside out, quite frankly, just through information and knowledge. I think with that, you bring a lot of, motivation and hope and I think encouragement because these lifers are at Millhaven maximum, they tend to be at the sort of very beginning of their life sentence. So I think for them to see people come inside, like just citizens sort of interested in connecting with them and staying connected and serving as a bridge to the community, I think that just really surprises them and has been a real positive sort of light for them to sort of, keep their eyes on the prize, that at the end of the day, they are working towards life, living a life, not a life sentence, but living a full life.
I think that's great.
One thing I think I would say, first of all, too, is because it's a maximum, we've tried to sort of get, sort of projects and initiatives and certain things off the ground over the years. It's been rather tough. And I think a lot of that is because of it being a maximum security institution. I think it's just a different ballgame than some lower security institutions. And because the men are sort of coming in and then they may be moving on, we're not necessarily, working with the same people in the same group all the time over the years. So we're constantly sort of, well, this might be a little bit subjective in my opinion, but I feel as though we are often sort of in a state of emergency, trying to provide information and provide access to legislation, policy, rules and regulations, and just sort of helping the men situate themselves and in their environment, and also helping them understand like their expectations and how they can even cascade down to a lower security. Yeah, so that's, I think, been the biggest thing.
I think that's so important. I think there is such limited access to programming and opportunity in the maximums that any kind of community involvement must be really huge for them. Have you noticed any difficulties with, because it is a higher security institution, therefore there tends to be more lockdowns. Have you noticed any particular problems or delays in terms of your group actually getting to its sessions?
So we have not been able to visit the institution since February.
Okay.
We were scheduled to go for March and sort of coming months, but because of the sort of, organization-wide lockdown in March, we just haven't been able to get inside. So there's a few ways to answer that question. We've been sort of trying to maintain communications with them at the institution, but because the staff contingent in the institution is low now because of COVID, staff not working in the institution or perhaps not even working at all, they're not able to access their voicemails or their emails. So quite frankly, like, for the first few months, we just didn't even know what was going on. We would try to, seek out telephone meetings with them or with someone. We wondered about video meetings, options that way. And quite frankly, here we are, it's November, and we're just, actually, it's funny, this morning, received an email from the social programs officer, our liaison, essentially, at the institution. And just this morning, it's sort of, here's the training, here's the deck about, your PPE, the cleaning agents and the cleaning requirements that are going to be required for all volunteers that are coming back in, that sort of stuff. So we've just received that, but we still don't really even know about getting back in, visits by phone, video, anything like that. And one thing that's actually quite strange is we've received word through, national CSC headquarters about the sort of protocols that they're putting in place for the volunteers, visitors, people from NGOs, people from community-based residential facilities. And there are different protocols. There's some nuances there, right? And how people are sort of being invited back in and where they're allowed to be. And that sort of stuff has been miscommunicated to us. Like, they're sort of saying that we're only allowed to have one volunteer go in at a time, which is actually the case for the NGOs and the CBRFs, not volunteer groups. I have argued that it's actually really unsafe for just one volunteer to go in with a group of lifers. Really, it's not smart for them, for the organization, in terms of opening up the door to risks and liabilities. It's not safe for the men, because things can sort of always be turned around on them, and the same thing for volunteers. you know, we've always been told to be extra cautious about, you know, all of the prisoners and everything else. So it's sort of undermines that sort of message about maintaining safety and everything else. So that's been kind of odd. So we're gonna try to see if we can't get at least 2 people in. Also because we drive from Ottawa to Kingston and back in one evening. So yeah, for so many reasons, we just would rather have 2 volunteers at minimum go.
That's a long drive, and that's shows a mark of dedication by you and your volunteers to go there and back in a day. That's excellent. Before COVID, were you having any difficulties with lockdowns? I mean, were you notified in advance if the institution was not going to be available to you?
Yes,
Okay, good.
yes, we would tend to be notified like that day, that morning. I think maybe once or twice we got sort of a more of a heads up, you know, like that things may or may not be back up and running in time for your visits or not. But no, they've tended to be pretty good. But I would say though, even, you know, sort of regularly, you never kind of know who's going to show up to the program room, to the meeting itself, because even then, if a few people show up, they will also say once they get to the group, oh, well, this range wasn't opened up, or, you know, that group wasn't able to come out or whatever. So there are still issues with different parts of the prison or ranges not being
Yeah,
opened
so
up.
you might have a range locked down and members from that range wouldn't be able to attend. Or they
Yeah.
might have been placed in the structured intervention unit or something and therefore unavailable to you. Yeah, that's interesting. And there's no real way to tell except from what the other prisoners are telling you, right? Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. So what are you hoping for in terms of the new normal?
Well, I mean, we are a little bit discouraged, you know, just with the sort of second wave generally of all of this
Yes,
stuff,
yeah.
right? But it's sort of gonna continue on. We were sort of getting a little bit more encouraged, you know, through the summer that we were going to be able to start up again in the fall. So we started to kind of ramp up. We had a new volunteer, you know, screen to join the group. Well, our screening, not the formal security screening through CSC. So we're, you know, trying to sort of ramp up activities again. But yeah, since CSC has had a lot more exposure to COVID and have had more lockdowns again, sort of institution wide. Now we're going to be pushing for the telephone or video visits. I mean, they are making it sound like we can talk about a visit. But we'll see how that goes. We'll see how that goes. I'm not quite sure in terms of the next visit, if it's going to be by video, phone, or in person. So we're anxious about that. We're anxious to get back inside and see what's going on. One thing I'll say too is we've tried to sort of maintain, well, not only communications with the institution, like the administration, obviously, but also with the men themselves in the lifers group. So what we've tried to do is sort of just write, like, you know, letters, updates, you know, sharing with them what's going on in the world. Like we spoke about a lot about Black Lives Matter and that momentum, and we spoke about yeah, different things going on, all the legislation that we're seeing prop up again now in government again, or federal legislation and policy. And we've been asking them to, you know, feel free, you know, write us back, let us know how it's going. Let us know if you're able to get your flu shots, so things like this, you know. And quite frankly, we've only heard back from former members who have cascaded on to other institutions.
So nothing back from Millhaven per se.
Not hearing back from Millhaven. So in terms of getting in, and we don't know if the men are writing back or if they're able to.
Yeah, so you're having, yeah, that's disconcerting, because how many men would normally attend the lifers group?
It's quite a range. Sometimes we'll only have 3 or 4 men in the group, in the meeting. Sometimes it's up to, gosh, I think 11, 12,
Wow.
probably up to that many.
And are I attended with you once, or as a guest, and it was in that little chapel area, right? Is
Yeah.
that where you're? Okay, so
That's
there's not a lot of room in there. Like if you were going to have it and maintain social distance, have you thought about the implications of trying to keep people 6 feet apart or anything like that? Would you need a
Well,
bigger space?
exactly. So one thing is it does depend on the men. Well, the first step is the men being part of the group. So how many men are there and are part of the group?
Yeah.
We don't really know how many, men are in the group, just based on how many of the lifers group are actually admitting to that group and how many are there presently. And we also, we also don't know who's still there, really, because it's been so long. It's funny, I was saying earlier about just hearing from the institution social programs this morning. One of our sort of questions was, well, can we plan to send maybe some holiday cards in? Because that's approaching. And normally we're not allowed to send holiday cards or bring holiday cards with us. I know, which is just sad, really. So we sort of thought, well, it's COVID, it's a pandemic, these are extenuating circumstances. Can we please? So they said no first. Then they came back and they said, yes, that's okay. We've got permission. You can send us the cards. We'll quarantine them for 3 days in the institution before we hand them out. And we asked, so how many, how many people are active in the group? And they said 4. So that's a very small number.
Yeah.
Of
There were
people.
certainly a lot more than 4 when I visited your group. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, there were in excess of like the amount of people they would allow in the program room for one meeting at one time. I think they had always said like the limit in that room was 10 or something like that. Yeah, we really don't even know. We really don't even know.
Yeah, it must be very frustrating for the men because, there's not much going on at Millhaven, and I'm sure the lifers in particular look forward to these monthly sessions to catch up on things and be treated with a bit of humanity, and it's good. Yeah, well, how are you hoping things unfold after the COVID crisis? Do you have any recommendations for, how they could have done it better when there's a pandemic, or what should follow?
Oh gosh. Well, you know what? I don't know if our group has sort of necessarily, sort of had these conversations specifically. But we've certainly talked about a few things, just the need for, ongoing, regular, consistent communications and updates. The information that we get from or hear from different places, different regions, different institutions. It's different, it's inconsistent, it's confusing. We've had a hard time even with just, getting the security screening processed. We've had to do renewals and onboard new volunteers and get new screening. That's been delayed and tough to do. So, it sort of hits at various levels. We're happy to go in, with the proper PPE, the right circumstances, the right environment. We're happy to do that. We've been saying we're happy to do that. We've also, been saying like, even if it's a matter of bringing an extension cord from the phone in the room next door and bringing it in and putting the guys on speakerphone, and then we can speak on a conference line from Ottawa, anything. And there's just been really very little, initiative from them to sort of do that or support. you know, any of that in reach.
Yeah. Do
So
you think it's important?
honestly, I would just like them to just want us to go back and want to be there to help and support people. Because honestly, Catherine, at this point, it's been so long. Like our conversations as a lifers group is starting to be, or as the liaison group, I should say, we're starting to talk a lot about, you know, what we're going to be in for when we get back in. Like,
Yes.
these
Yeah.
these are already very delicate situations, people with a lot of stress, you know, it's a really, really anxious, violent, traumatizing, terrifying environment. And now we've laid on isolation and all, you know, all of these other layers. And quite frankly, like we just don't know how we can be better equipped and what kind of tools we need as volunteers to go in when we get back in, because you know we don't have all this training in the world, you know, we're just people trying to do the best we can with what we've got. So you know, that might be something that I'd be interested to learn more about. Like we're sort of starting to look into our own training opportunities, like because we've saved the money with gas, maybe we can invest that in training and, you know, mental health first aid or something like that, right? Like, so
Yeah. My hunch is, I mean, I've been into Millhaven recently because there was a hunger strike, and I went in after that. And there's no question, there's a lot of anxiety there, right? People have been locked up too long. The tension levels are going to go up. The lack of activity can be very bad. But I got to tell you, the men that I spoke to couldn't have been more polite and more calm, and you know, so yeah, I think it will take a little while, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see them, you know, really responding positively to having some external stimulation. You know, I think it's particularly important in the maximum security facilities. So,
well, this is it. And I mean, yeah, on a good day, you know, or well, I guess we only go in monthly. So a good month, you know, we will hear about the constant lockdowns as it is, you know.
yeah.
There are constantly lockdowns in maximums. So the boredom and the frustration are at a ridiculous level.
Yeah.
Anyways, a baseline.
Do they tell you how long they're normally in cell every day?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think it depends on if they're working or if they're in school or programs or whatever else. It doesn't sound like much, and I do not have a clue how it is now, to be honest. One thing we heard was that I was contacted by a loved one of one of the lifers, and she mentioned that her son was trying to fundraise to get more PPE, more cleaning agents, that kind of thing. And that was kind of thwarted. He wasn't able to do that. But she was looking forward to having a private family visit with him in the trailers. So I'm hoping to hear that went through. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, it's grim, right? It's grim.
Yeah, it sure is grim. Well, I hope that they get back into having the volunteers in. I'm sure it's disruptive to the volunteers to be ready to go and not have access to the prison, but more so to the prisoners who come to, you know, welcome you and to feel that they are being connected to their community through you. So hats off to you and your group, and I really hope that you're back in action relatively soon.
Thank you. So do I.
Thank you, Susan, for doing this. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure.
Okay, take care. By Rick Sauvé. Rick has been working in the prisons for a very long time, providing peer support, and we wanted to get his views on the implications for lockdown for prisoners and their programming and their prospects for getting some sort of release. Thank you for joining us, Rick.
I'm happy to be here.
That's great. So can you tell us a little bit about the kind of programs that you've been offering in the prisons?
Yeah, so I've been doing a number of things. I do a lot of one-on-one counseling with guys. helping them navigate their way through the prison system. And working on reintegration and stuff like that. I do a lot of parole hearings. Still able to do some, even with the COVID happening.
That's good.
Prior to the lockdown, I was also offering, delivering a program called Breakaway, which was working with men whose crimes were involved in the gang culture. And so I had been doing that in all levels of institutions, the minimums, the mediums, and I just finished doing the maximum at Collins Bay Institution. We also were delivering another reintegration program. We just did a couple of those sessions, and then again COVID hit, so we couldn't do any more of those programs.
So when you were active before COVID hit, how frequently would you be going into the prisons, and how many prisoners would be involved in the programming?
Well, I was going into almost all the prisons, doing one-on-one with guys. So I was doing that. I would go up to Beaver Creek on Mondays or Tuesdays, going to Warkworth once a week. Pittsburgh, which is now Joyceville Minimum. Frontenac, I try and get down to Kingston at least every other week. When I was delivering the programs, I would be delivering that 1 day a week. The last few that I did were down in Collins Bay. And it took about 2 or 3 years, but finally we got it into to deliver the program in the max, which was really, really successful.
Yeah, that's good. There's not a lot going on in the maxes, so any kind of program is really great.
Yeah, there really wasn't nothing. In fact, when I went into the max unit, I was shocked at how little there was for guys to do. They were locked up on the range in the units pretty much all day. There was very few jobs.
This is not when they're being subjected to a lockdown. They're just generally locked in all the time.
Yeah, so they there's very few jobs for guys to do. There was a couple guys that were 3 or 4 guys I saw in the school, and there were some cleaners jobs, and that was about it. And so when I offered, finally got permission to go in and do the breakaway program in the max unit, guys were really excited about doing it. It allowed them to get out of their units, but also to start that kind of thinking beyond the max. And I was shocked at how little there was for guys to do in there.
Yeah. So did you find that there was much disruption in terms of prisoners not being able to participate because they were placed in SAG or locked down or otherwise confined in ways that wouldn't make them available for your program?
There was a number of lockdowns. So when I did the max unit, it took what should have taken, because it's done over an 8-week period, 1 day a week, but it took me probably 4 months to get it done, just because of lockdowns. And what made it difficult is it's a 3-hour drive for me to get down to Kingston. And so sometimes I would get down to the institution, and then when I got there, I'd find out that it was locked down, and then just get turned away. And so, yeah, it took a lot longer than I would have liked.
And did the men talk to you at all about how they felt about the lockdowns and the program being disrupted like that? I mean, did they find that difficult?
They did, because when lockdowns would happen, quite often they wouldn't know why they were being locked down. They just wouldn't be allowed out of their cells, and then the rumors would start and stuff like that. So yeah, it was disruptive for them. And it was something that they had to look forward to every week, was coming down to do the program. Because especially in the Max, they weren't, all those guys that were in my group weren't able to do other programming.
Right. Yeah.
And so that was kind of like the first time that they actually got to experience that. And so I was able to talk to them about the reality of what they would be facing as they moved down. Just kind of instilling some hope in them, and giving them a little sense of direction.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent. Yeah, and so since COVID hit, you haven't been able to go in at all, or what's been the implications for your programming?
Yeah, I haven't been able to do any programming in there.
March, would it be?
Yeah, it was towards the end of March. And so, especially for the guys that I was working with, preparing them for release after prison, helping them get ready for parole hearings, those sorts of things. All of a sudden, I wasn't able to get in there to do the one-on-ones with guys. And so I was able to do some parole hearings at first, but it was by phone, and it was really, really awkward because when you're a parole assistant, you like to spend some time with the guy, the prisoner, to prepare them for the hearing, to go over some of the kinds of questions that they would be asked. And so with the just doing it by phone, the phone would be put right next to the speaker, and it was really, really difficult to hear. So if it made it really difficult to ask for a break, because sometimes, when you're doing a parole you're assisting at a parole hearing, you can ask the parole board members for a break, and they often encourage that. And so because I didn't have any contact with them, I wasn't able to do that. Lately, I have been able to do some, the last few parole hearings that I've been doing, I've been going into the institution to do them. And it's a lot more beneficial.
Yeah, that's great. We've certainly heard a lot of frustration from people who are trying to get to parole, particularly lifers who have to do a certain number of ETAs and UTAs, and they just can't get them. So they really feel frustrated that the momentum has been disrupted.
Yeah, there's most of the UTAs aren't happening anymore. Even if somebody's been granted a unescorted temporary absence, they can't do them. Because they'd be quarantined when they go out of the institution at the halfway house, and they'd be quarantined when they come back. So it's just not feasible for them to do that. The ETA programs have pretty much all been curtailed. So at the minimums, prisoners who were going out on regular escorted temporary absences, that's with staff, they've been stopped. But work releases, where guys would go out and do community service or work releases, that's all been stopped. And so what it's done is, I would argue, is kind of arbitrarily lengthen the prison sentences, because if you can't go through the first step of escorted passes, you can't get UTAs. And if you can't go out in the UTAs, it's very difficult to build the credibility to go out on day parole. And so, I know of a couple guys that I assisted at parole hearings, and they got their first UTA in, but they couldn't get the rest of them in. Prisoners that have been released, and rather than just having them put on a bus to go to Windsor, I've been providing transportation for them down to Windsor.
Wow.
So so the process that we've been doing is they would get tested for COVID prior to leaving the institution. The first couple that we did, because there was no visits happening in the institution, they could, my supervisor asked if they could be put in the PFV to be quarantined prior to being released. And so what corrections typically what we're doing was they would just buy them a bus ticket and say, take the bus to Windsor or wherever they were going. And we didn't think that was safe. We didn't think it was appropriate. And so I've been providing some transportation to make sure they get down there, and also to be able to help them decompress after being inside, and just giving them some tips on how to live in a COVID world now on the outside.
Yeah, it's very startling anyway to come from a prison into the community, but to come into a community that's in during a pandemic where there's all kinds of different rules must be doubly so.
Yeah, very much so. And also too, what that was helping them with is they didn't have to be quarantined at the halfway house because they'd already been tested. So they would get tested again in the community, but they weren't quarantined for 14 days. So that, they could start that reintegration process back in the community. So that's been really, really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent. So how do you envision things returning to the new normal? You indicated that you were going to go into one of the prisons sometime this week, which is great. But do you think the programs are gradually coming back?
I don't believe they are. I think they should. In fact, we made a proposal that for me to go back into the different institutions to do just sessions with guys to talk about the realities of living, going into the back into the community during a pandemic. And so what we suggested was that I could go in, meet with some of the guys that are going to be released and just talk about the realities of the challenges that they're going to face, because different communities are handling the COVID differently. And so if somebody's going to Toronto, they may not have the resources available to help them, to deal with the pandemic. Some of the other remote areas, it's different again. And so we thought that it would be a really good idea to help them prepare for that going back into the community, because they're not getting a lot of exposure to people in the community to hear what's going on. Right.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I think that would be enormously helpful. I think a lot of particularly some of the lifers that I've spoken to, they're losing hope. Right? I mean, they saw a route out, and then all of a sudden they saw nothing but roadblocks between them and the route out. And I think that's not good. And anything that can be done to kind of rekindle the notion that there is a possibility, you've got to keep trying, you've got to keep moving forward, I think would be really beneficial.
Well, yeah, and for several months, there was no visits. So there was, so that further isolated the prisoners inside, that they didn't have that contact. And they weren't able to get in front of the parole board, a lot of guys, because there were no passes happening, and so that was slowing everything down. And I've been getting a lot of calls from guys inside, that are frustrated and saying, like, geez, I was working on a release plan, and now I can't. Like, they don't know who to turn to or what to do. Similarly with families, I've been getting a lot of calls from family members saying the same kinds of things, like, they don't know what's happening inside. They don't know when their family members coming out. And so there's that real sense of frustration that's developing, and a sense of hopelessness.
Yeah, I think it's very bad. It's very bad indeed. I know that one of the lifers that I was speaking to, I mean, I think at the beginning there was some hope that if you were older, you might have been medically vulnerable, that they might have been looking to get people out early. And I think that may have upset the correctional staff, because he was told, don't think that you can take advantage of the pandemic to get out early. And he said, no, I just don't want to be handicapped and have the pandemic actually impede my chances of getting out. And that seems to be what's happening. It's actually having a very slowing effect on people. If you've got numbers and you've got a stat release date or an end of sentence, that's fine. But if you're an indeterminate prisoner, it's having consequences for your amount of time in prison. I'm sure it is.
Well, very much so, and especially too, like the halfway house staff, they're not being able to go inside to the institutions to meet with guys, and so for me, that's affecting public safety. You know, they're expected to take stat release cases or some cases that they haven't been able to build a relationship with the guys. And so I think that they should be starting to open that up more. There's precautions that can be taken, that can be done safely, to allow the community supports to be going in and doing those one-on-ones with guys. You know, like if I go in to do a parole hearing, they take my temperature. You know, there's hand sanitizers. We stay at, you know, an appropriate distance apart. And so I think that they should be allowing more and more community-based organizations to get in to do that kind of thing.
Even if
it just doesn't make sense.
Somebody able to go in maybe with a tablet that would connect them with the people in the community. I mean, even some kind of you know, electronic communication would be better than nothing. Like, this is bad. This has been very bad.
Yeah. So I am going to get to go into RTC, the Regional Treatment Center, provided there isn't a lockdown. So I'm going to be going in on Thursday of this week to meet with and the parole officer and the psychologist were really, really helpful in helping that to happen. And so I'm hoping that, you know, that's going to crack the door a little bit to allow me to get in to meet with guys. When I was in doing a parole hearing last week, there were 3 or 4 guys that were doing work, perimeter work it's a minimum security. And so as soon as they saw me, they were, hey, Rick, like, when can you come in? There's a whole bunch of guys that want to see you. They've got parole hearings and they don't know what they're eligible for. They don't know when they can, you know, when they can have the parole hearing. How do they get a hold of you? Those kinds of things.
Oh, yeah. Well,
you know, and so,
yeah, it's been extremely disruptive, and punitive in many ways, not just because of the illness, but the implications that it's having for release prospects. It's been a negative experience for many. You know, Rick, I think everybody values what you do for prisoners, particularly the prisoners themselves, in terms of having someone with experience who will have immediate credibility with them and can help guide them and tell them what they need to know. And the sooner you get back in there, the happier we will all be. I really want to thank you for taking the time with us today to share some of your observations and concerns. It's been very illuminating, and I appreciate it.
well, thanks, Catherine. And I know this is going to sound kind of weird because I've been doing this for so many years, and, you know, I've been in prison myself for so many years, and I almost felt that I needed to get back in there.
Yeah.
Just because I was hearing the frustration and the fear from some of the guys, especially guys, older prisoners that have medical issues.
Yes. Yeah.
They were very concerned. are they gonna live? And you know, just recently, if I can, there was a gentleman. He was hospitalized with terminal cancer, and he'd been turned down by the CAT team because they said that they weren't sure whether his risk would be manageable in the community. And he was given 6 months to 2 years to live. And so I'd been doing phone calls with him, you know, for a few weeks. And when the last time I spoke with him, I was reaching out to a couple other halfway houses to see if he could, you know, possibly be accepted. But of course, with the CAT team, it's not just the halfway house that was making this decision. It was community parole, and he died like a week and a half after my last conversation. And I thought, how sad that was, that, you know, they just looked at the file instead of saying, you know, this is somebody that, you know, could die with dignity in the community.
Absolutely.
To the credit, he was able to pass away in the hospital in Kingston, but otherwise he'd be in RTC. And so you know, that's why I want to get back into the maxes and into the mediums, just to let those guys know that there's somebody out there that's thinking about them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the extent to which people are going in, whether it's to deliver programs or whether it's volunteers, it makes such a difference to people on the inside. It can never be underestimated, the extent to which that's valuable for individual prisoners and ultimately for community safety. No question about it. So let's see what we can do to make it happen. That's good.
Okay. I'm ready to go back in.
Okay, that's terrific. Thanks, Rick. You take care.
You too.
Okay.
Bye now.